Hello everyone, I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox, hosted by Richard Lummis.
Hello and welcome to another episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast about leadership. This is Richard Lummis. I'm here with Tom Fox for another discussion on how to improve our leadership skills by learning from others, drawing lessons from many sources, including history, fiction, film, and business writing. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Today, we're continuing our series on U.S. presidents to discuss James Monroe of Virginia, the fifth president in office from 1817 to 1825. Prior to that, he served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War and being wounded at the Battle of Trenton. After studying law under Thomas Jefferson, he served as a delegate to the Continental Congress under the Articles of Confederation. He later served as a United States Senator in the First Congress, then later as Governor of Virginia. As a diplomat to France, he helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase before serving as Secretary of State and Secretary of War for Madison. He's probably best known today for the Monroe Doctrine, which was probably not his idea and didn't become known by that name until the 1850s. Today we're going to discuss some of his other substantive accomplishments as president, in addition to that one. He was the last of the founding fathers to serve as president, and he was also the last of what was called the Virginia dynasty, and where four of the first five presidents came from Virginia. He did own slaves throughout his life, and he was actually the personal target of an abortive slave revolt when he was governor of Virginia. Tom, what did you find most striking about Monroe and his leadership style?
Well, Richard, if I can start with one and then circle back to it at the end, because I had anticipated this podcast would turn on the Missouri Compromise, which was one of the signature pieces of legislation during his time, perhaps the signature piece. But what I found in our research was that he was largely not in a leadership role in that, although he did play an important part at the end that perhaps we can circle back to. So I was a little surprised in that. A couple of, or maybe one observation that we were talking about before we went on air, when I recalled my prior study of Monroe, I just remember he being quite a bland character. And certainly between or following three or four of our greatest presidents and the ones after him, perhaps are a little more famous as well, and that sort of like the 1970s, nothing really happened. Nothing really happened under his administration. But as we looked into it and as I researched for this podcast, I found several things that I thought were significant and certainly useful business leadership, not only concepts, but actually tactics. And the first tactic that I either was not aware of or I'd completely forgotten was that Monroe was the first president to go out to all of the states. Now, I don't mean to say he went to every state, but he traveled throughout the United States. He traveled up to Maine, he traveled out to Detroit, went to south, I think to South Carolina, and went into what was then the West. So he literally got out of the ivory tower and went out into the field. Yeah. And for a business, and particularly on his first trip, it was great acclaim from the populace, and they were thrilled to see their president come to what was then a very far-flung far-flung travel. In fact, the first trip took him 15 weeks. So that was 15 weeks he was away from Washington. But it really pointed up to me not only the need for a business leader to get out of the office and travel, but also the positive benefits. The times that I have been a general counsel or other position on an executive leadership team in a corporation, when I did travel out internationally, frankly, the troops were thrilled. They were thrilled that someone from the home office would come out and see them, and they would give you information that they would not give you in an email and would not give you over the phone. So it was a great way to communicate. And finally, it helped me develop a personal relationship with people so that then later, if an issue did come up, they felt comfortable in emailing or calling me because I did have a personal relationship. So I was really struck by that tactic that Monroe used, the first president to use it. It's now used by many other presidents subsequently, but it was just get out of the office. Get out and go meet your constituents, meet your employees, meet your customers, meet your suppliers, meet your agents, meet your vendors. It is a very positive thing. It means something to both the people you meet and something for you as well.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting tactic on his part. Now, it's called the era of good feelings, and we're supposed to think, I think, that the decline of the Federalist Party had led to sort of a unity of thought and feelings among the country, but I think that was kind of a myth. But you're right that by going out and having personal interaction with the citizens, that he definitely got things off on the right foot.
In fact, to your point on the misnomer of the era of good feelings, I now recall in my high school textbook, it was my chapter was entitled "The Era of Factionalism and Sectionalism." So I guess it just depends on how you look at things, which also leads to a point that we both commented upon earlier, which is Monroe occasionally suffers from comparisons to the Virginia dynasty of Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. We both laughed that he was certainly not a Renaissance man like Jefferson because his overwhelming interest and passion was politics. But that led to one of his strengths that we could talk about, which was he was a deliberate thinker and had the ability to look at an issue from all sides, encouraging debate from his advisors. This is not the sort of, really types of debate that we talked about in the Madison podcast, because he really encouraged debate from pros and cons within his cabinet. He had a really stellar cabinet of top-notch thinkers, and that they brought numerous options to him. He was not forced to go to war with any of the major European powers, as Madison had, but he had several important issues come up during his presidency, and having those types of personnel around him allowed him to stretch himself and his vision, because he surrounded himself with top-notch people. So clearly another sterling leadership lesson from that component of Monroe's character.
Well, and I think it's also important to note that his cabinet was deliberately geographically diverse.
Yes.
And this was at a time when many of the grave political differences were based on geography. What was then the Old West of Ohio had very different interests from the manufacturing centers of New England or the cotton plantations of the South. But by putting people from each of those groups in, he definitely made sure that he heard a variety of opinions. He did deliberately exclude Federalists from it, so he didn't necessarily want complete ideological diversity, but I thought that was interesting. And the other thing is, he always made it clear that he was the final arbiter.
Yes.
He encouraged robust discussion, but he knew when to cut it off and say, this is what we're doing. And then once everyone had their marching orders, they tended to be quite loyal to him, I think because they had been heard.
And that really leads to 2 points I wanted to raise, which was that leaders face challenges that others are unwilling to engage upon, and just because an idea has more votes doesn't make it right. And the two leadership principles I drew from that were that Monroe would take the council and would indeed perhaps even allow a cabinet vote, but at the end of the day, he was the leader and he was willing to face the challenges that others were unwilling to do so. So whether it was kind of a pro or failing to score any victories in Congress, he was able to have a huge voice for the country because he took on issues that others were not willing to face.
Yeah, and I guess one of the other things about him was that he was always courteous.
Yes.
Which, again, I think goes a long way to make people feel that they've had a legitimate hearing, that they've been able to air their opinion, and that it was considered.
He was not the fastest decision maker. He was very deliberate, but I think we both worked for people that were deliberate in their decision-making process. They were deliberate in their speaking, and I found that to be something that also a business leader should consider. It's not the speed of your decision. It's not the number of decisions you make. Sometimes you need to be deliberate, and I recognize that it may be you may have to intuit when you need to have some more deliberation. But sometimes the best decision is not always the quickest one when you can take counsel and then come to a decision.
There was one incident during his presidency that I wanted to talk to you about and get your opinion on it. As basically, it's a personnel matter, and at the time, slaves from Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina were fleeing across the border to Florida, which was then owned by Spain, and living in the swamps with the Seminole Indians. And so Monroe sent Andrew Jackson to Florida to basically stop this. And I'm blanking on the name of the fort that was there. That was actually manned by fugitive slaves. But anyway, so he invaded Florida, interpreting his instructions rather liberally, shall we say. Took control of Pensacola, deposed the Spanish governor, and then he executed 2 British citizens. This almost caused another war with England. And then his cabinet was fighting over whether to reprimand Jackson or not.
Right.
So what did you think about this?
So from the leadership perspective of Monroe, as opposed to Andrew Jackson, I had a couple of thoughts. One is that you need to consider the person you send to do a job is whether they're qualified to do that job. Now, as a military leader at that point in the country's history, Andrew Jackson had as high a profile as any military leader. He had just subdued the Creek and Cherokee Indians in Alabama. His tactics were well known. And I think that...
And shall we say not politically correct?
And not politically correct, if we can use that term on this podcast as well. So the question is, did Monroe choose the right person? As an American expansionist, I would say he did. And I would say that he chose Jackson because he was the foremost military leader, but also because of Jackson's known reputation. Now, what that led to was the point you raised on the execution of the 2 British citizens. And, I'm not sure what Monroe's responsibility is there, although I would have to say he had to have, if not been aware, was responsible for vague orders that someone like Andrew Jackson would interpret in the broadest scope possible.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that struck me was that the man who wanted to reprimand Jackson was Calhoun, who was, of course, a slave owner and a representative of the South, on whose behalf Jackson was actually waging this rather interesting campaign. And his defender was John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts. And I would have picked them as being on opposite sides of that.
Yes, although Jackson became in conflict with both of those later in life, so perhaps not surprising.
Well, and of course, one of the things about John Quincy Adams was that he was able to use this or these events to convince Spain to sell Florida.
Yes.
So in the end, it all turned out well, but it was just an interesting example of a possibly runaway employee and what you can do to minimize that.
What I guess we can only speculate on, but my guess has always been that Monroe knew exactly what he was doing, and that was the entire reason to send Jackson down there, that he knew he would do something that would cause the Spanish to become amenable to a sale. Not that Spain didn't need the money in 1819. I think that was the date of the sale.
Sure.
But it certainly led to the United States accomplishing something that had been a goal for quite some time, which was to bring the Spanish country of Florida into the United States of America.
Yeah. And subsequently, Monroe did recognize the breakaway colonies in Latin America
Yes.
that had rebelled from Spain, but not before he was able to buy Florida, which I thought was probably not coincidental.
What I'd like to do now, Richard, if we could, is circle back to the Missouri Compromise.
Sure.
Because this was the point or the issue with the greatest import, certainly historically, in retrospect at least, from the Monroe administration. And I had anticipated that we would talk about Monroe's leadership during this legislation leading up to the bill. And it turned out it wasn't really his leadership at all.
Yeah.
But he did play a role in it. And his role was an interesting role. It was different than I had recalled from my historical memory, but it was a role that I think a business leader can draw, if not inspiration, certainly lessons from. And his role in this was to sign the bill. And he signed the bill even though he thought it was unconstitutional and he thought it was wrong. Nevertheless, he believed that if he did not sign the bill, even in 1820, that there might be some sort of civil war. And so he subsumed his reservations for what he believed at that point was a greater good. Perhaps if you want to debate whether they just should have put on the boxing gloves and done it in 1820, it would have been less of a bloodbath than in 1861. Perhaps we could have that debate too. But I found that to be a very interesting lesson for the business leader, that Monroe was able to subsume not only his preference but his personal feelings and do something which he thought was the greater good for the country.
Yeah, a quick refresher, in case you don't remember your high school history. What happened was Missouri was petitioning for admission as a slave state. At the time, the Senate was evenly divided between slave and free states, and so the admission of Missouri as a slave state would have tilted the balance in the Senate in favor of the slave states. The ultimate compromise was that Maine would be admitted as a separate state, so that the balance in the Senate would be maintained, and that slavery would be limited in the area, or not allowed in the area north of 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude, which was the southern border of Missouri. Ultimately, this caused a lot of problems because only 2 states were subsequently admitted. I guess 3 if you count Texas. South of that,
I would count Texas.
Yes, but 9 north of it. So yeah, I agree. He did show leadership here by subsuming his personal preference. And as a slave owner, I think that was fairly innate in him, that this was. We would expect him to have a different opinion about this, but yeah, it was good. Now, whether kicking the can down the road is always a good idea, I think we could also argue that point at length.
It really was a fascinating research project, Richard, because I had several preconceptions I came to this research for this podcast on, and it turned out that most of them were either completely wrong or what I found was different. The leadership lessons were different from his that I would have anticipated. Nevertheless, he was president for 8 years, so he must have been some sort of positive leader, or he was elected once and reelected once. So I found that a fascinating character, lots to unpack, and some significant lessons really for the 2017 business leader as well.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you, Tom, as always. It's always interesting, and I've really enjoyed our series on the presidents, which we will continue at some later date. For now, this is goodbye from 12 O'Clock High, and we hope you keep listening.
This is Paris Fox again. We hope you enjoyed this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox. If you enjoyed the show, please go to iTunes and rate the podcast. Thank you for listening.